A little over a century ago, Europe's major powers made decisions that would plunge the world into what was then the most cataclysmic war in human history. Joining us now for the full hour to chronicle how the world approached the war to end all wars, Margaret MacMillan. She is the author of The War That Ended Peace, The Road to 1914. She's also professor of international history at the University of Oxford and the University of Toronto. And we're happy to welcome you, Margaret, back here to TVO.
Thank you.
I want to pick up on the title of the book, The War That Ended Peace. Just how peaceful was Europe really at the dawn of the 20th century?
Well, by comparison with what had come before, it was very peaceful. I mean, the 19th century had been, in European terms, because it's had a pretty awful history, really, when you think of it, but in the 19th century had been really a time of peace, prosperity, and progress. Now, there had been wars, but those wars had mostly been between two antagonists, and they'd mostly been short, and they'd mostly settled things. And so Europeans by 1914 were thinking, you know, we've come to expect peace. We deserve it. It's what we do now. We don't do wars anymore. We've advanced beyond it. And so I think really when you look at the mood in 1914, I think it was an expectation that this long relative peace was going to continue.
Long relative peace meaning it'd last, what, four decades or so?
It really lasted since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, when the last Battle of Waterloo and the Napoleonic Wars happened in 1815, after that, you really did get this long period of peace. There were the wars of the Italian unification, the wars of German unification.
1870s.
Yeah, 1870s, the Crimean War. But really, most Europeans had not been troubled by war in the course of the 19th century. And if you look at the 18th century, look at the 17th century, it was very different. And so I think for Europeans, peace had come to be something that they really expected would last, which is why I had that title for my book.
Let's look at some of the major players in the world at that time, and you give us a sense of what their significance in the world was. Starting, of course, let's start with Great Britain. Great Britain in 1900 was what?
Well, if you want to use a modern term, it was the hegemonic power. I mean, it was occupying the place in the international order that the United States has occupied since the end of the Cold War. It was the big power. The British Empire was the biggest in the world. The British Navy was the biggest in the world. Britain was the world's greatest navy, world's greatest trading power. And so the British really, I think, saw themselves as somehow the policemen of the world or responsible for the world. Now, rather like the United States today, the British were being challenged by rising powers. The new Germany, which was unified in 1871, had rapidly become a major economic power. It was building a navy. The United States in the Western Hemisphere was rising to world power. Japan in the Far East was beginning to rise. So Britain was dominant, but never as dominant, I think, as the United States was after the end of the Cold War.
How about France?
France was a troubled power. I mean, the French have a long and complicated history, and of course what a lot of French remembered was that they had dominated Europe for much of the 18th century, and of course in the Napoleonic period, Napoleon had been the master of Europe. But France had gone through a very bad period. It had lost, of course, the Napoleonic Wars. It had been forced to accept peace terms. It had had periods of revolution in the 19th century. And then it had lost a war catastrophically against the German Confederation in 1871, the so-called Franco-Prussian War. And so the French, I think, were feeling torn, I think, really between this glorious past and thinking they should be playing a greater role in the world. And of course, they still had a big empire, but feeling threatened. And of course, one of the things they feared most of all was their neighbor Germany, because there were more Germans, and the German economy was bigger, and Germany was growing faster than France, and the German army was the best in Europe. And so the French were apprehensive, I think, which is why, of course, they made a treaty with Russia on the other side of Germany.
And that was the third country I was going to raise in this triple entente. There was England, there was France, and there was Russia.
Yeah.
What was their place in the world at the time?
Well, the Russian place was changing a lot. I mean, what we tend to forget about Russia is just how well it was doing before 1914, because we look back through the lens of the Russian Revolution in 1917, the civil war that followed it, and we tend to assume that Russia before 1914 was a basket case. In fact, it wasn't true. It was modernizing very, very quickly. It was building railways. It was building modern industry. Its growth rate was probably the highest in the world at the time, and it was well on its way to becoming a major industrial and economic power. Now, that didn't mean it was a happy country. There were tremendous strains in the system, and you had an autocracy which was very creakily and rather resentfully moving into the modern age and conceding some form of constitutional government. But I think it's fair to say that really Russia was one of the great success stories before 1914.
Let's look at the other side of the ledger. You mentioned Germany became a country, unifying the German states in 1871, so it's only about 30 years old. Is it a world power yet in 1900?
Well, it is and it isn't. Germany, of course, is younger than Canada, which I always find curious. The Germans were definitely the dominant, or one of the dominant powers in Europe, and certainly the dominant army in Europe. But what they didn't have was an empire. And in those days, people thought you couldn't really be a world power unless you had an empire. Meaning
all sorts of interests in Africa or Asia, that kind of thing.
Yes. And we don't think that anymore. We tend to see empires actually as often an economic drag and causing all sorts of problems. But for Germany and for many people at the time, having an empire was a sign that you'd really arrived. And of course, the problem with Germany was that it had come into existence so late that a lot of the best pieces had been snapped up. And so Africa had been virtually divided by the time Germany had a say, and it only picked up a few small pieces. What the Germans were looking for was the last undivided bits of the world, and that included the Ottoman Empire, based in Turkey, of course, but which also included a lot of the Arab Middle East and even included parts of Europe and the Balkans. And it was also looking to China. But there was this push in Germany that if we're going to be respected, if we're going to be taken seriously, we have to have an empire.
What was the Austro-Hungarian Empire?
The Austro-Hungarian Empire was this conglomeration of countries, cities, and bishoprics, areas which had been amassed by the Habsburg over many centuries. The Habsburg ruling family were brilliant at marrying people who would bring them in yet more territory. And so they had this vast empire. It had shrunk a bit in the 19th century, but it was still pretty big. I mean, it stretched from Polish territories in the north right down to what are today Croatia and Slovenia, and included what is today much of Romania, included, of course, Hungary, included what is today Austria.
So very ethnically diverse.
Very ethnically diverse. I think they had to have something like 12 official languages.
Hard to get along with 12 official languages.
Yeah. Well, it did cause problems, and increasingly they were getting problems by the end of the 19th century. They were getting tremendous linguistic battles in the Czech and German-speaking areas. They were terrific battles, political battles between Czechs and Germans about which language would be the official language. And there were some pretty awful scenes in parliaments where people threw things at each other. But, in a way, we look back and we see the Austro-Hungarian Empire did actually manage to keep all these different ethnicities and peoples and religions in one big unit. And of course, economically, it benefited them all because it was like a great common market. And so it was a creaky empire. I think it was very much aware of its own internal problems, and it was very concerned about what was happening on its southern border in the Balkans, and also very, very concerned about Russia, which was becoming increasingly a rival.
Which countries, if you had to gauge them, of the time seemed more militaristic than the others?
Well, I think Germany, certainly, because the core of Germany, of the new Germany, was Prussia. I mean, Prussia was the dominant part of the new Germany, although Germany was made up of a number of states and city-states. Prussia, I think, represented something like 70% of the population. And Prussia was a country which had really come into existence because it had a very good army. There's the old joke that Prussia is not a country that happens to have an army, it's an army that happens to have a country. And the Prussian army became the core of the new German army. And I think there was, particularly in Prussia, the Prussian part of Germany, which was that huge part of the north, there was a real sense that the military is somehow the nation. And they've made the nation, and they somehow represent the best and noblest part of the nation. Therefore, civilians shouldn't question them. And that, I think, was dangerous because the German military saw themselves as somehow being beyond civilian control. And unfortunately, too often, the civilians acquiesced in that.
So these are some of the major players in the world at the time, the dawn of the 20th century, as we've talked about. As we get closer to 1914, it seems really bloody apparent that the world's going to go to war. But before that, how inevitable did it feel before that?
Well, I don't think it did. And of course, always the danger with history is you look back, and we know the First World War broke out, and so we look for the reasons why it was going to break out. And again, that's why I wanted to call my book The War That Ended Peace, because I think we also need to ask, why didn't the peace continue? Because there were a lot of people who wanted peace, not just thinking, oh, it's the normal state of affairs, but people who were working actively for peace. And there was a very strong middle-class peace movement, which was pushing for things like arbitration to settle disputes among nations, very strong international working-class movement called the Second International, which constantly talked about how it would not support general war because that was only going to benefit the capitalists, the owners of the factories, and the people who would make the money out of the war. And so I think we need to remember that a lot of people in Europe didn't think war was inevitable. Now, what we do, of course, as historians, is we look back and we say, yes, but. there are all these factors. There are these nationalisms, these imperial rivalries, Germany's desire for a place in the sun, Austria-Hungary's fear of disintegrating, France's fear of Germany, Russia's fear of Germany and Austria-Hungary. So you can see reasons why war might break out. But they'd got through similar crises before 1914 and war hadn't broken out. And I think we always have to remember that.
There was you're going to remind me who said this in the book, there were two people having a conversation, one German, one Brit, and they sort of figured out a way to divide the world. They said, you let us English have the seas, you Germans can have the land, and we'll just divide it all up beautifully and we can have peace forever. Do you remember who I'm talking about there?
No, I can't remember myself. I'm sorry, I should remember my own book and I can't.
And I just read it and I can't remember it either.
It was a very common view because Germany had the biggest land army, Britain had the world's biggest navy. The two were each other's greatest trading partners. They had all sorts of other links from the royal families right on down through society.
Explain that, the royal families.
Well, the British royal family was essentially German. In fact, I think most of them spoke with German accents up until George V. Queen Victoria's daughter had married the son of the first German Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm I, and so their son became, Queen Victoria's daughter and her German husband's son became Wilhelm II. And so there were very, very close links there. And other sorts of, the families were so intertwined. And so a lot of people argue really the natural alliance which would benefit both sides was between Germany and Britain.
It seems to, just the way you've described it, make a great deal of sense. There are trade links between them, there are family links between them, they're the two dominant players both on sea and on land. Yeah. How did this just not work itself out? It should have.
Yeah, well, I've always thought this. Well, there are people on both sides who wanted it to work out, but I think having closer trade links doesn't always make you friendlier. It can make you nervous about how well the other side is doing, or the other side may want to keep you out of markets. And you get a lot of alarmist literature in Britain saying, watch out, the Germans are expanding, they're cutting into our markets, they're taking over. And you've got a lot of alarmist literature in Germany saying the British are selfish, they don't want us to have an empire, they don't want to share the world's trade with us. I think always of the United States and China today, who have a very close economic relationship. It doesn't seem to have brought greater friendship, does it?
Not greater friendship, but nobody's talking about these two countries going to war.
No.
China holds too much American debt. Why would they do that?
Yeah, well, I know, but you do get sort of hotheads on either side saying there may well one day be a conflict between the United States and China, which I think is probably absurd. But a lot of people in both Britain and Germany were uneasy about the other, and I think that didn't help. My own view is what really drove the British away from the Germans is the Germans' decision to start building a big navy.
Once they had designs on the water, that changed things, didn't it?
Well, and what the British said is, why do you need a big navy unless it's to challenge us? And of course, looking at geography, any big German navy would come sailing straight out, either through the Kiel Canal, which was widened and available for big ships coming out by 1914, or through the straits going past Denmark. And where would they come out? The great big German ships would come out right by the north coast of England and threaten the shipping routes through the English Channel. And so from the British point of view, a German navy could not but be a menace to the British Isles. And the Germans kept on saying, oh no, we're just building it because we want colonies and an empire. And the German theory, which turned out to be absolutely wrong, was that if we build a navy, it won't ever be as big as the British Navy, but it'll make them think twice before taking us on, so it will force them to be friends with us. The British will have to be friends with us because we've built a big navy and they don't want to have to fight us because they've got other enemies around the world. It was stupid because what the British decided to do was, in fact, accept the challenge and match the German shipbuilding and outdo them.
Thus began an arms race.
Thus began an arms race, and also more than that, it drove the two countries apart, and it created suspicions on both sides. It's really interesting. The British had a whole line in invasion literature, scare things, foreigners coming and landing on British shores. Up until about 1900, the foreigners who were going to come were the French. After 1900, as the Germans got into full gear building their navy, the foreigners who were going to come and menace Britain were the Germans. And I think at the popular level, you begin to get real suspicion. And because both governments have to respond to their electorates, what people are thinking in the public now begins to make a difference. So when you get waves of fear going through Britain that the Germans are coming, there's even an absurd story that there was something like 50,000 German army officers disguised as waiters in British restaurants waiting for their moment. You can't imagine anything more ridiculous. So, but when you get this popular fear, it becomes more difficult, I think, for governments to do what is the sensible thing and try and remove the antagonisms, the reasons for antagonisms between the two countries.
There's a theme that runs through the book frequently, which is this notion of how important honor was back then. And you hear royalty, you hear politicians refer to it all the time about how urgent it is that we that we act with honor and maintain our honor and do whatever we have to hold our honor. Could you talk to us some more about the significance of that in the world back then?
Well, I became, as I was writing the book, very interested in value systems. You know, of course human beings are human beings and they're moved by fear, emotion, love, whatever. But the systems of values within which they grow up and which they absorb and which become part of them can really vary from one sort of society to another. And so, you know, in Canada today, we don't particularly value military virtues. We admire the military, but we don't think everyone should be like them. But in certain societies, and Germany I think was true of this before 1914, there was a reverence for military values, and there was a lot of talk about honor, and not just the honor of individuals, but the honor of nations. And so you get statesmen saying, it is a matter of honor that we do this. Now today they'd probably talk more about credibility or prestige. I mean, in some ways I think it's not that different, but I think these values, which are intangible and very difficult to measure, actually affect the way in which people behave. I mean, you get people in Russia saying in the summer of 1914, if we don't support Serbia against Austria-Hungary this time, we will be dishonored. And you know, I think these are very deeply ingrained ways of feeling and believing. And of course, a lot of the people who dominated the European military in the officer class and dominated the foreign offices and often dominated politics came from these old aristocratic landowning classes where notions of honor were very important. I mean, not in Britain. Well, in Britain the similar notions were important, but in Britain you didn't get the cult of the duel, which you got across the continent of Europe. You know, it was expected that young men of a certain class would protect their honor by, if necessary, fighting duels, and if necessary, getting themselves killed. It's
not that out of date a concept if you think about it. I think of one of your previous books on Richard Nixon, who talked about ending Vietnam. You know, we want peace with honor.
Yeah.
There we go again.
Yeah, no, I think it is important. And, you know, we see it in the way that often gangs operate. You know, young men in gangs don't want to be dishonored. And they will be prepared to take steps to defend their honor.
A couple of answers ago, you referred to the monarchy wanting, and the politicians wanting to be on the right side of their respective publics. Yeah. And it does pose a question, or raise a question about how important public, you know, obviously today public opinion is huge for politicians. Back then, did it matter?
It mattered, and it was becoming more important because increasingly European countries were extending the franchise. In Germany, the Reichstag, the German parliament, was elected by universal manhood suffrage. In other words, all men of voting age could vote for the Reichstag. In Britain, the franchise was more restricted, but it had gradually been expanding through the 19th century. In France, I think most males could vote. Even in Russia, there was a Duma, a parliament, by 1907. And it wasn't just that, there were mass newspapers by 1900. So newspapers with mass circulation, you know, circulations of 800,000 a day. I mean, these were big newspapers. And you also got the appearance of lobbies. You began to get naval lobbies, army lobbies, colonial lobbies, and governments didn't like it. I mean, Lord Salisbury, who was the conservative British Prime Minister for much of the 1890s, said, you know, I don't know where it comes from. He said, it's like having a gigantic lunatic asylum at my back, but he had to deal with it. And so increasingly you get this awareness, even in states like Russia, that we have to worry about what the public is going to think.
And the monarchs felt that way too? Kaiser Wilhelm II cared what the German Volk thought?
Yes, well, he tended to think that they thought what they thought was what he wanted. Right. But he did worry about it, and he was very uneasy by 1914 because he had actually advocated peace in previous crises. He'd helped to broker solutions when there had been a crisis, and he was uneasy because he knew that there were mutterings, both in the soldiers and in the German press, that he was a coward. And so I think public opinion can act to make you do things you may not want to do in a number of ways.
So he could, a lot of losing face if he didn't be as belligerent as his public expected him to be then.
Yes.
I see. There's a wonderful picture in your book of two gentlemen who look like identical twins. They're not, but they are the King of Russia and the King of England. Yeah. Talk about those two and the relationship they had.
Well, the King of Russia's mother, or the Tsar of Russia's mother, was the sister of the wife of Edward VII, who was the father of George V. So Nicholas and George V were first cousins. And they looked so alike that people often mistook them one for the other. And in fact, they used to quite like playing a little game when they were young men. They'd dress up exactly the same, which is what the picture shows, and then they'd wait to see who would mistake them for the other.
Same beards even.
Same beards, and both rather sort of shy men, both not very good at sort of getting out and chatting to people. So in temperamentally, I think, they were probably a bit the same. Of course, the big difference was that Nicholas II was the autocrat of all the Russias, with huge amount of power, and George V was a constitutional monarch who had no power.
And Nicholas II was not going to survive very much longer, and he didn't know it at that time, did he?
No, Nicholas II was going to be murdered with his family by the Bolsheviks in 1918. And there is still speculation about whether George V could have done more to help his cousin escape from Russia. We'll never know.
There are, and you pose them in the book, a lot of great what-if questions. Yeah. That was one of them. There's another one about Queen Victoria. Yeah. Queen Victoria, of course, is dead at this point.
Yeah.
If she had been alive to watch all of the trouble that her offspring and her nephew and grandchildren had got into, could she have done something about this?
I don't think so. People often wonder about it, and Wilhelm II actually said as war was breaking out, if only our grandmother had been alive. But, you know, Queen Victoria's authority was limited, and people keep on saying, well, you know, they're all related to each other, all these crowned heads of state. Couldn't they just have had a family conference and settled it? And my answer to that is always, have you ever been in a real family fight? You know, they can be pretty rough. And what's more, I think, I mean, these crowned heads identified themselves with their own countries. I mean, often in an almost mystical way, that they had been put there by God. And so Wilhelm II saw himself as Germany. Nicholas II saw himself as Russia. George V saw himself as Britain or as England. And so the idea that somehow family ties would be stronger than that, I think, just wasn't going to happen.
Let's add another name to the list. Franz Ferdinand. Who was he?
Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. He was the nephew of Franz Joseph, who was the old emperor. I mean, Franz Joseph was quite old by this point, quite sick. I think his main goal in life really was just to preserve the empire and not have too much change, or hope that not too much would go wrong. Very sad family life. His wife, whom he adored, had gradually drifted away from him and then had been stabbed to death by an assassin. One of his brothers had been shot in Mexico when he tried to become emperor there. And his only son had committed suicide at Mayerling with his mistress. And so Franz Ferdinand had become the heir, not much loved by his uncle, but in fact an interesting man, and a man who had ideas about trying to move Austria-Hungary perhaps more into the modern world, try to deal with some of the nationalities issues. The other thing about Franz Ferdinand was that he was very wary about Austria-Hungary going to war. He thought it would be the end of Austria-Hungary to get involved in a major war.
And he was right about that.
He was right about that, yeah.
You pose another great what-if question. Because his assassination was sort of the spark that lit the fuse, if you will, the world lost one of the moderating influences of the time who might have been able to do something about World War I. You think so?
Well, I think in the end, I mean, there are a number of factors to World War I, but if you want to look at how the crisis finally developed after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand on June the 28th, the first step towards a world war is when Austria-Hungary says, we now have the opportunity, we've wanted to get rid of Serbia. We think Serbia is behind this assassination. We don't have terribly good proof, but we're just going to go for it anyway. We're going to destroy Serbia or bring it under control. Franz Ferdinand, I think, at least going by what we know of how he behaved on previous occasions, would have said no. It's crazy. We do not want to go to war with Serbia, because if we do, Russia is likely to come in, and that would be the end of us. And so one of the great ironies, I think, is that the assassins removed someone who might have stopped that slide towards war. With his removal, the hawks in Vienna had exactly the excuse they wanted to go after Serbia.
And they did.
And they did. And they were reckless, because they knew that Russia might well intervene, and they
did.
And they did. Yeah.
Who was the dominant political figure in Great Britain at this time?
Well, there wasn't a single dominant figure in Great Britain, because it really was a cabinet government. I mean, and the decision to go to war in Britain was probably the most carefully argued and thought out and difficult decision made by any country. I mean, it was truly a cabinet decision, but there were certain key figures who had to be in favor of war. The Prime Minister himself, Henry Asquith, was, I think, convinced, certainly by the beginning of August 1914, that Britain would have to intervene against Germany. His Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, was also persuaded of that, but they had to bring their colleagues along with them. Just in the cabinet was split. There were some very strong anti-war figures, and they also had to worry about splitting their Liberal Party, because there was a very strong anti-war wing of the Liberal Party. The key figures who, I think, helped to swing the British decision towards war were Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Full disclosure, ma'am?
Oh, well, my great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather.
My great-grandfather.
David Lloyd George.
Yeah, and he had generally been for peace. He was not someone who took much interest in military affairs, although he was very conscious of Britain's position in the world. And it was his move, I think, towards saying we probably will have to intervene that helped to bring some other people along with them. And then you had people like a younger Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty in charge of the British Navy, who was for war all along. But it would have taken Lloyd George really, I think, to move the cabinet and bring those who were opposed to war along.
It's a given today that civilians control military decisions.
Yeah.
Back then, where you have elected representatives, you have a monarch, and you have very powerful military figures, where does the balance of power lie?
Yeah. It depends really on which country you're talking about. In Britain, there was firm control over the military, although even the British cabinet did not, I think, realize the full extent of the military conversations the British Army had been having with the French, which helped to impose certain obligations or moral obligations. In France, there was civilian control over the military. In Germany, there really was not. The military really saw themselves as making policy and not really bothering too much for the civilians. And I think there was a real failure on the part of the civilians who did not do enough to inform themselves of what the military were up to. You know, the crucial decision that the military made before the First World War was to fight a two-front war. In other words, they didn't plan to fight just Russia or just France, either
together.
of whom. They decided they would have to fight them together.
Although they thought they'd get rid of the French in pretty quick order, which would allow them to go get Russia.
Yeah, the plan as it evolved by 1914 was that they would strike with the bulk of the German forces against France. They would knock France out in something like 6 weeks, and then they'd switch those forces over to the Eastern Front because Russia would take longer to get its forces into place because of the distances. And of course, to get at France, what they decided to do was go through Belgium.
Which was neutral.
Which was neutral, and its neutrality had been guaranteed by a number of European powers, including Britain, France, and crucially, including Germany.
So Germany decides to, in its invasion plans, go through Belgium.
Yeah.
Automatically, you're opening up a whole can of worms.
You're opening up a whole can of worms, and when the civilians learned about this, and they didn't really get a full sense of what the German military plans were until 1912, when they learned about it, their attitude was, if that's what the military says is necessary, well, we'll just have to deal with the fallout, which is a real abdication of civilian control, I think. And then there's this crucial moment just as the crisis is really reaching its head, just at the end of July, beginning of August, where the Kaiser, who really at this point is panicking about the prospect of war, says to his military, can we just go against Russia? Russia's moving, can we just go against Russia and not attack France? And the military say it can't be done. And again, the civilians don't say, don't say that, don't tell us that. You can do it. That's what military meant to do. They're meant to make plans. And so you get the civilians just throwing up their hands and saying, well, if the military say we have to do it, we have to do it.
Now, Belgium, despite being neutral, had a pretty formidable army of its own, did it not?
It had quite a good little army. What it also had were very strong forts, because the Belgians had always been worried about defending their neutrality, and they'd always been very careful not to make any alliances with anyone. I mean, they wouldn't make alliances with the French, with the British, with the Germans. I mean, for them, neutrality was something they would defend against all comers. And of course, what the Germans were assuming is when the Belgians got their ultimatum, and the Germans sent an ultimatum to Belgium and said, we want to come into Belgium, not because you're our enemies, because we're afraid the French might be coming. And so we trust that you'll let us just come through. And the Belgians, much to the German surprise, said no.
Did they have a choice about that?
Yeah, they could have acquiesced.
They could have said yes.
They could have handed over the front. They could have opened the frontiers. They could have ordered their armed forces not to resist. And that's what a lot of the Germans assumed would happen. And in fact, the Belgians decided, and there was tremendous sort of feeling in Belgium about it, that they would resist. And what that did, well, it did a number of things. What it did is slow up the German advance, so it began to disrupt the German war plans. It caused the Germans increasingly to react with hostility and often terrorist tactics against Belgian civilians. I mean, as the German armies moved through, they began to behave badly, and they began to shoot civilians. They began to drag them off for forced labor. And what that did is begin to swing opinion, not just in Britain, where it was very important, but ultimately in the United States.
Let me read this excerpt from your book, and it'll give you a chance to get a sip of water if you want to, and then we'll come back with a question. While many of the historical debates have centered on the question of Germany's or Austria-Hungary's or even Serbia's culpability for the war, others have placed the blame on the Triple Entente, on whether on France for following a policy of revenge against Germany, or Russia for the alliance with France and for backing Serbia, or on Britain for not recognizing Germany's legitimate demands for a place in the sun and a greater share of the world's colonies, or for not making it clear early in the crisis that it would intervene on the side of France and Russia. While these have fascinated and will continue to fascinate historians and political scientists, we may have to accept that there can never be a definitive answer because for every argument there is a strong counter. Did you come to any conclusions about all of that?
I think the conclusion I came to is that if you want to explain the origins of the First World War, it depends what period you're looking at. If war had broken out in 1913 rather than 1914, you would point to different causes. what happened in 1914 is obviously dependent on what happened in previous years, but I think there are crucial decisions made in 1914. But I never saw my role as saying, you know, there is the guilty person or there is the guilty thing, because it's such a complex combination of people, circumstances. What's also important is what had happened previously, so what they're remembering. So Russia's remembering that it backed down in previous crises. So now what people there are saying, we're not backing down this time. Germany is remembering that it didn't back Austria-Hungary in previous crises. So what the Germans are saying, we have to back them this time or we lose them. And so it's a very particular set of circumstances. And I just don't think you can point to one thing, which is why there have been, someone's counted, I don't know how he or she did it, there's something like 30,000 things written in English on the origins of the First World War. You know.
30,001 now.
30,001, yeah.
Well, one of the things I really enjoy about your books is you put these little nuggets in there that really stay with me. And you had lots of them in Paris 1919. And one of them that stayed with me in this book was the notion that although Gavrilo Princip, the Serb assassin, takes out Franz Ferdinand at the end of June, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is saying to itself, we can't immediately attack Serbia because all of our soldiers are still in the fields farming. And it'll take them a month or two to get off the farms, and we can't let them off the farms yet, or we'll have no food for the year. Now that's a kind of military planning that you don't hear nowadays.
I know, and it had been actually instituted as a way of keeping soldiers happy. But you know, they got caught, and then when the government said to the military, "Well, bring the soldiers back from harvest leave," the military said, "Well, if we do that, it'll alert people that we're up to something." So you know, they're caught. But what happened was because the Austrians delayed, and it drove the Germans crazy. The Germans kept on saying, "For heaven's sake, get going!" But what happened, because they didn't do anything to Serbia for 4 weeks, sympathy in Europe, which had actually been a lot of sympathy for Austria-Hungary when it was assassinated, a lot of feeling that Serbia was really, you know, behind this, and the Serbian radical nationalists were really causing all sorts of trouble. If Austria-Hungary had moved right away, I think a lot of people would have said, well, they're a bit precipitous, but it's done. Serbia's going to have to pay some sort of penalty. But the longer they waited, the more people thought, you know, it's not really that serious.
Do we know 100 years later whether Princip was acting alone or on behalf of a greater Serbian governmental effort?
I'm not sure we'll ever know for sure. And that's because those in the Serbian government who were supplying the weapons to Princip and his fellow conspirators, I mean, their weapons came from the military armories in Belgrade. They practiced shooting in the park, one of the main parks in Belgrade. They were clearly being encouraged by certain elements within the Serbian government, but nobody was keeping records of this. You know, this was all shadowy stuff. There was this group called the Black Hand, who were a conspiratorial group devoted to a greater Serbia within the Serbian government. And as for the government itself, I suspect that the Prime Minister at the time, Nikolai Pasic, realized that something was going on, but chose not to know about it. You know, or was also, I think, not prepared to take them on. He was in the middle of an election campaign. There was a big political crisis. And so I think we'll never know for sure who knew what when, but I think it's clear that there were links to the assassins going back somewhere into the Serbian ruling structure. But you know, when the war came, the Serbian government took the chance to try in a very hasty trial and shoot the head of Serbian military intelligence, whose nickname was Apis, because they suspected he had too many secrets to spill.
Because this was the spark that lit the fuse, I should ask you, because it's a very dramatic moment actually in world history, to describe the assassination of the Archduke and his wife. Tell us how it happened.
Well, it was a series of accidents. And you know, you can still argue, and I think I would, that if those accidents hadn't happened, Franz Ferdinand might be alive today and we might not have had a First World War. He went to visit Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia, which was a new province of the Austrian Empire, which they just annexed. And this had infuriated Serbia because Serbia had its eye on Bosnia. So it was a tactless thing to do, perhaps. So here he is in Bosnia. He then decides to go to Sarajevo on the 28th of June, the capital of Bosnia. That's the second tactless thing, because the 28th of June is the anniversary of the great Serbian National Day, which commemorates, among other things, their defeat at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389.
Which they still talk about 600 years later.
Which they still talk about 600 years later. So here comes the Archduke from the hated Austria-Hungary, which has kept Bosnia out of Serbian hands. He comes to Sarajevo on the 28th of June. And this was announced beforehand. Security was hopeless. And so you have these young men armed with bombs, pistols, and cyanide capsules, which they're meant to take so they can't be caught. And as the car is going, the procession, they come to the railway station, the procession's going along something called the Appel Quai at the time. It's a road that runs along the river. It's still there, you can go and see it. And they were going along beside the river, and one of the assassins threw a bomb at the motorcade, missed the first car, which had the Archduke and his wife in it. Bomb exploded, injured people in the second car, a lot of consternation. The assassin tried to jump into the river, but it's a very short distance down, so he was caught. They then proceeded to the town hall, pretty shaken, one man very badly injured, taken off to hospital. The people in the town hall then say, look, we think you should get out of Sarajevo to the Archduke. We think you should go straight back to the railway station and clear out. We can't protect you.
What does he say?
He says, no, he said, I will go, but I'm going to go to the hospital first to see the man who was badly injured when the first bomb was thrown. And so they go down back the road beside the river, and they take the wrong turning. The chauffeur turns into a fairly narrow road, and I've actually seen it. You can see the plaque on the wall outside a there used to be a cafe there. And one of the assassins happens to be waiting. This is Princeps himself, who'd organized the whole plot. He's wandered along trying to find out what's happened, because nobody knows there have been reports of an assassination attempt. And so he's basically wandered along aimlessly, standing in a crowd on the corner. Suddenly, the Archduke's car turns right in front of him. There are shouts. People say, no, 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 it's an open car. You've made the wrong turning. The chauffeur is fumbling with the gears, trying to back up. And the car is stationary, and Princeps, who's probably not a very good shot, stands on the running board and shoots the Archduke and his wife point blank. And they're probably dead by the time they get to the governor's palace where they're going to be taken. Nobody knows for sure. The Archduke says to his wife, Sophie, you must live for the sake of the children, and dies, and she dies. And so sheer accident. You know, if that wrong turning hadn't been taken, or if the Archduke had listened to the warnings and not gone to Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary would not have had the perfect excuse it needed to do what it wanted to do anyway, and that was get Serbia.
Princeps was 20, right? They couldn't execute him because he was underage.
Yeah, he was underage, so he was tried, and he was defiant to the end. He refused to say whether there were any other conspirators, although that most of them had been rounded up. The cyanide tablets, as it turned out, were sort of out of date, the capsules, and so it didn't work very well. It just made people sick. And so he was imprisoned, and he died of tuberculosis in an Austrian prison during the First World War, and as far as we know, unrepentant for what he had unleashed, or his act had unleashed.
Are there any statues or anything like that to him today in Serbia?
Yes, it depends where you go. In Sarajevo, which is predominantly Muslim, there are not statues to Princeps, and there's a very neutral plaque simply saying that the assassination took place on this particular corner. The plaque has gone through several iterations. There used to be a rather triumphalist one, which was actually given to Hitler as a birthday present during the Second World War. But in the Serbian part of Bosnia, there is at least one statue to Princeps, and in Serbia itself. And I believe, unless I'm wrong, that Princeps' face is going to be put on a Serbian coin or banknote. And so like so many things in history, it depends on your perspective.
Sure.
He's a freedom fighter for one group of people, he's an assassin for another group.
Okay, about 10 or 15 minutes to go here, and we should just talk about the first series of steps that took place now that the spark has lit the fuse. Your book, almost 700 pages of it, really talks about the lead up to the war. It doesn't go into great detail about what happens after the first shots were fired. But, okay, Germany proceeds to invade through Belgium. Austro-Hungary now wants to take on Serbia. These two things beget other things.
Yeah.
What immediately?
Well, Russia begins to mobilize even before Germany goes into Belgium on its way to France. Russia's mobilization is always a problem. I mean, all these armies, with the exception of the British Army, are conscript armies, which means you have to call back the reserves. I mean, you have so many people in uniform, and then you call all the reserves back, which makes these massive European armies. Russia's mobilization takes longer than anyone else's because of the distances people have to travel and because its railway system isn't as good. So the Russians are probably, and there's much dispute about this, probably beginning preparations for mobilization even before they announce it. But they begin to mobilize fully at the end of July. Germany then responds, says if you don't stop within 24 hours, we're going to have to mobilize both against you and against France. Austria-Hungary, in the meanwhile, is sort of dithering around. I mean, they've actually declared war on Serbia, but they don't have any army to go and attack it, so they lob a few shells across the river at Belgrade, which is very conveniently just on the other side of the Austrian border. And so they don't actually attack Serbia until the first week of August, and they don't declare war on Russia, I think, until the 8th of August. But I mean, once Austria-Hungary begins to move against Serbia, it's clear that it's going to have to fight Russia as well. And part of the Russian forces come to the Austro-Hungarian border, and the other part go towards the border with Russia, because they have but with Germany. Germany and Russia have a common border in those days because there's no Poland between them.
Mm-hmm. Poland disappeared for a century.
Poland disappeared for a century, divided up between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And so the armies begin to move, and of course the final question is, what will the British do? And the French have no choice. The Germans send them an ultimatum saying, we understand that you may be preparing military moves against us. And the French, in fact, were being very, very careful. They were keeping their troops, I think, 10 kilometers back from the frontiers because they didn't want to provoke Germany. The Germans say, you know, we fear that you're moving against us. To show that you're our friend, please hand over all your frontier forts. We'll give them back to you when the war is over. And of course, the French can't do this.
Can't do that.
No. And so the Germans say, you have the ultimatum, if you don't respond to our request for the frontier forts, we will attack. And so Germany begins to move its troops at the beginning of August through Belgium on its way to France. The British have this tremendously difficult weekend. It's a bank holiday weekend in Britain, so it's Monday is a holiday. So Saturday the cabinet meets, Sunday the cabinet meets, Monday the cabinet meets, and by Monday they've decided they will have to respond to the invasion of Belgium. And so Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, goes to the House of Commons on the 3rd of August and says, we have sent an ultimatum to Germany that if they don't stop moving against Belgium and France, by 10 p.m. tomorrow night we will consider ourselves in a state of war. Sorry, it's 11 p.m. We will consider ourselves in a state of war. And of course nothing comes from Germany. And on the Tuesday, the 4th of August, the cabinet sit in Downing Street waiting for a reply from Germany. And at 11 p.m., Big Ben begins to strike, and they know they're at war. And so Europe goes. It's really quick. It's 5 weeks from the assassination to a general war.
You say really quick, but you know, if we make the comparisons to World War II, Poland invaded by Hitler September 1st.
Yeah.
2 days later, England declares war, and they're in right away.
Yeah.
So it's 2 days then.
Yeah.
This wasn't 2 days.
Yeah, but I think with this, yeah, no, you're quite right. But with the Second World War, it had been expected. You know, and I think Britain had given a treaty of mutual defense to Poland, knowing that it might well mean war. But you're right, it broke out very quickly. Of course, what's also different about the Second World War from the point of view of Canada is we declared war separately.
Yes, indeed. So which anticipates my next question, which is once England's in, once Great Britain is in, that automatically means Canada's in at this point, doesn't it?
Yes. In 1914, when Britain declares war, it's on behalf of the British Empire. There's no question the Empire isn't consulted. But in fact, most of the empire just assumes that it should be in. I mean, in Canada, the reaction is we have to come, especially, not among all Canadians, but I think especially among English-speaking Canadians or recent immigrants from the British Isles, which were a majority of immigrants to Canada in those days. There was a sense that, you know, it's the mother country. We have to fight. Australia, New Zealand felt the same. Newfoundland felt the same. South Africa had only become part of the empire much more recently, and so there, I think, feelings were more mixed. And India, at least initially, supports the war. Even Gandhi, who is going to become, of course, the great nationalist leader against the British in 1914, supports the war effort.
It is, I want to ask you about Italy, because it really is, it's quite a thing to be on both sides of a world war once, but they actually were twice. Yeah. Can you explain where Italy was at the beginning of World War I, or in the lead up to it, and then on the eve of it?
Yeah. Well, the Italians were in a funny position. They had an alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany, so they were part of what came to be called the Triple Alliance. But they had real problems with Austria-Hungary because Italy had actually freed part of the territories that became Italy from Austrian rule. And there were still some Italian speakers within Austria-Hungary. And so the Italians, I think, really saw Austria-Hungary as more of a hostile power than a friendly one. And both were rivals in the Balkans, and particularly the western part of the Balkans, for influence. And what was convenient, and I certainly cannot blame the Italians, the treaty they had was a defensive one. And so they were only obliged to come to the support of Austria-Hungary and Germany if either was attacked.
And they weren't.
They weren't. And so Italy, I think quite rightly said, we are not coming into this war. And then, of course, it becomes the prize for both sides because its geographical position is very important. It wasn't a major military power, but you think of its long sea coast, its role in the Mediterranean. And so both the British and the French and the Russians, the Triple Entente, and then what's become the Dual Alliance, try to lure Italy into the war. And the trouble is what Italy really wants is a lot of territory from Austria-Hungary. And so the Germans say to Austria-Hungary, oh, go on, give it to Italy. And the Austro-Hungarians say, nothing doing. Whereas the British, French and Russians can say to Italy, we'll give you whatever you want from Austria-Hungary because it's not going to bother them. And so eventually, and there are other reasons, I mean, I think opinion in Italy, I think, especially on the liberal side, is for intervention on the side of what they see as more liberal democracies, Britain and France. And so Italy does come into the war in 1915.
Again, making some comparisons to World War II, there's nobody who's under any illusions today about how that war started or who's responsible or that kind of thing. There still is about World War I, isn't there? Still some confusion about who's ultimately responsible for this thing happening?
Yeah, and I think that's because it's very hard to pin ultimate responsibility anyway. You know, I think that's why we'll go on and on arguing about it. Is it the impersonal forces of history, such as nationalism, economic rivalry, militarism? Is it the value structure, which put a high premium on things like honor and not backing down? Is it individuals? Is it individual nations? Is it an accident? You know, I mean, we should never discount the possibility that the whole thing was just an awful accident. You know, Europeans in the summer of 1914 said, oh, another crisis in the Balkans. Well, we've had 2 of those, 3 of those. We've got through them.
They were on the beaches, weren't they?
Yeah.
They were still on the beaches, frolicking around, some of them.
Yeah, and what a lot of people assume, too, is most wars that had happened in Europe had started earlier. If you wanted to have a good war, you wanted to fight in the summer. Unlike, I mean, in Iraq, you don't want to fight in the summer, but in Europe, you want to fight in the summer before the rain starts and everything gets muddy. And people thought towards the end of July, it's too late to have a war this year. And so things will be diffused. Well, it wasn't too late.
We also heard stories that countries, in an effort to mobilize their troops, said, come on and get in here, this thing's going to be over by Christmas and you don't want to miss out. Is that true?
Yeah, no, a lot of young men joined up. I mean, you know, they thought they wanted to be in at the excitement. And you've got whole graduating classes from high school going off and joining up together. There was a French high school class, all the young men went and joined up, 1 was left alive by Christmas. You know, some people foresaw it. Some people had said, look, you know, war is changing, the power of the defense is getting very strong, the combination of rapid firing guns, the combination of that with trenches and barbed wire means that it's getting very, very difficult to attack a well-defended position. Kitchener, who became the British War Minister at the outbreak of the war, said it will be at least 3 years. But most people, I think, had this illusion that the war would be short because that's what the previous wars they'd seen had been.
U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, offered his government services to the European powers in an effort to mediate, moderate. Did that go anywhere?
No. Wilson had been terribly preoccupied. I mean, it was a moment of personal tragedy for him. His first wife was dying, and he was at her bedside. And I think he sort of tore himself away, and he realized, I think, with appalled shock, that Europe was going into a general war. And he did offer his offices as a mediator, and the Europeans weren't having any of it. I mean, later on, as the war dragged on, they were more willing to listen to the United States. And the United States, of course, had become more important as the war dragged on. But no, it was seen as an interference from someone across the ocean. This was a European affair.
As I pointed out earlier, this is a book that focuses on the decade and a half that leads up to the beginning of World War I. It doesn't spend a lot of time on what transpired during those 4 years. But we should remind everybody, the casualties in this war were off the charts, staggering and astonishing. There were countries that lost millions of civilians. Let's go through some of it. Do you remember the numbers off the top of your head of how many Frenchmen died, how many Russians died, how many Brits died?
Well, no one can agree on the exact figures because in some cases the records weren't kept well, but I think it was 1.4 million Frenchmen. The French lost more men proportionate to their population than any other nation except Serbia, which also took horrendous losses. 800,000 British, or from the British Empire, including probably about 60,000 Canadians. Again, the figures are never quite exact. 800,000 Germans. You know, these are the equivalent sizes of cities that were being killed. And this was a war in which more men, combatants, were getting killed than civilians. The Second World War, of course, is very different because of the bombing of cities. But in the First World War, although civilians did suffer and civilians did die, it was not on the scale that the fighting men did.
When it became apparent that the casualty rate was going to be so significant, why didn't saner heads prevail?
Well, it's such a good question, and I think saner heads kept on trying to prevail. I mean, you've got people on all sides, and you've got people such as the Pope saying, look, this is the time to sit down and talk. But you know, the terrible casualties had an awful momentum of their own. I mean, if you are the British or the French or the German or the Austro-Hungarian or the Russian government, do you say by Christmas 1914, when it's clear what the casualties are like? I mean, some of the worst losses take place in those first few months of the war, some of the highest losses. Do you say, look, we made an awful mistake. We got into this war, we're not going to win, we're just going to cause the death of a lot of people, as we already have done. We're not even going to get anything out of it. We just think we should stop. How do you do that politically? You know, how do you, as a government, say, you know, this was a pointless war, we're not going to win anything?
Well, you fudge it. You don't say that, but you don't double down on something that's just going to give you endless more misery, right?
But if the other side isn't willing to talk, you know, if the British and the French and the Russians had said to the Germans, look, we really want to sit down and talk, the Germans would have thought they must be fearing they're going to lose. We now need to redouble our efforts. And the same thing happened when the Germans sent out peace feelers. The reaction on the Allied side was they don't mean it, or they're beginning to feel the pressure. You know, we have to keep going. I mean, I think the terrible, I mean, you get this language, and you get it at the peace conference too, the sacrifice. How can we justify this sacrifice if we don't come out of the war with something? You know, how can we just say it was all a ghastly mistake? And when you look back at it, it was. I mean, you look at how prosperous Europe was, and how far it had moved since 1815. You know, how you had these big modern cities, people were living longer, living better. You look at what they had, and you have this awful feeling that they just threw it away.
World War II had 50 to 80 million dead, but I think it's fair to say something good came of it, right? Hitler was destroyed, fascism was destroyed, Japanese fascism was destroyed. There was something good that came out of World War II. Did anything good come out of the 20 million wounded and 16 million dead of World War I?
Well, what's so interesting is it depends when you ask the question and who you ask. I mean, if you'd ask people right after the First World War on the Allied side, a lot of them would have said, yes, it was worth fighting because it destroyed German militarism. And then it was really later that the doubts crept in, that perhaps that wasn't necessary, perhaps it didn't have to be done, perhaps Germany wasn't such a menace. You know, and you still get these arguments. You get them in Britain today. I mean, the Conservatives in the Conservative part of the coalition in Britain tend to argue that the First World War was a justified war, that Britain actually did the right thing, and tend to dismiss the view that it was all a total waste. And so, you know, I think our views of wars change a lot. But certainly the Second World War is much more clear-cut morally, except that we don't always ask awkward questions about it. Yes, it was necessary to destroy Hitler, but we were allied to one of the most dreadful tyrannies in the world.
Stalin.
Yeah, in the Soviet Union, and we did ourselves do some pretty awful things in the course of that war. So, you know, even the Second World War, wars are never sort of morally clear. I mean, you can say there's one side is better than the other, one cause is better than the other, but dreadful things happen in wars.
Never 100% morally clear, but you having studied so many of them, would you agree that World War I was probably the most morally ambiguous and the least, I mean, yep. So little came out of that was constructed. The world was back at war 20 years later.
I know. I mean, you can see the destruction of the war and what it did to European society and what it did to the world. I mean, I suppose what good did come out of the First World War is a recognition that we need stronger international organizations. And we tend to write off the League of Nations as a failure. But I think it could have worked. That it didn't work was due again to a number of accidents, including the United States not joining. It might have worked, and I think we did move at least partway towards recognizing that it's important to build strong international orders to try and prevent this sort of thing happening again. At the end of the Second World War, we moved a good deal further.
Margaret, in our last minute and change here, you've written this book, 700 plus pages. You did Paris 1919, which was also a pretty thick tome, if I recall. Have you said everything you want to say about World War I now?
I think I have. I mean, people sometimes ask me if I want to do the middle bit, the war itself, and I don't think so. I mean, I'm interested in military historian, but I'm not a military historian, so I think I might move to something else, and my next book is going to be tiny.
Well, I'm tempted to ask what you consider to be tiny for you.
Well, 50,000 words, 100 and something pages. I have done a couple of little books.
How long was your Nixon and Kissinger book, and Mao and all of that?
Oh, that was long. That was 200 and something thousand words.
Yeah.
But I did do.
You don't write short books, do you?
No, I did. I did a biography of Stephen Leacock, which is quite short.
Well, you couldn't really do 700 pages on Leacock, could you?
Well, I probably could have done, but I wasn't allowed to.
Good. Usually at this point in the interview, I say it's a great pleasure having had you in here. And while it was a pleasure to speak to you about this time, it's an awful time. Yeah. It's just an awful time. Yeah. But I think we know it a whole lot better now, thanks to your having written The War That Ended Peace, The Road to 1914. Margaret MacMillan, if you read this one and if you read Paris 1919, you'll probably know everything you really need to know about World War I. Thanks for coming into TVO tonight. It was a pleasure having you here.
Well, it was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Not at all.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.